Coincidence is defined as the occurrence of events that happen at the same time by mere chance, without any apparent connection. But is that all there is to it? Are these moments truly random, or could they be the result of unseen forces, perhaps guiding us in ways we don't fully understand? As we delve into incredible stories of coincidence, we have to ask ourselves, is there more at work here than meets the eye? Welcome to What a Coincidence, where we explore the astonishing world of coincidences, stories so bizarre and unlikely that they truly do blur the line between chance and destiny. Whether it's history, survival, or just everyday encounters, these tales remind us that the truth can be stranger than fiction. So, join us as we uncover the mysteries hidden in the folds of time and marvel at how life's most unexpected moments can leave us wondering, what a coincidence. In 1918, the world was in the grip of the Great War, a conflict unlike any the world had ever seen. Entire nations were mobilized, and young men from across Europe, America, and beyond were thrust into the hellish landscape of trench warfare. Among these young men was Paul Beck, a soldier from the small town in the Midwest who had been sent to the front lines in France. Like so many others, Paul had left behind his family, friends, and everything he knew for the uncertainty and terror of war. Paul was just a farm boy at heart. Before the war, his days were spent tending to fields, caring for animals, and dreaming of a future that seemed as simple and steady as the land he worked. But that future was shattered by the outbreak of war, and soon Paul found himself in a foreign country surrounded by the constant threat of death. The skies were often darkened by smoke, and the air was filled with the sounds of artillery, gunfire, and the cries of the wounded. Yet, even in the midst of such horror, Paul found solace in one small thing: a book. Not just any book, but a well-worn copy of the life and works of William Shakespeare, given to him by his mother before he left for the front. She had been an avid reader, and though Paul didn't share her passion for literature, he carried the book with him out of love for her. It was a reminder of home, of the life he once knew, and of the people who were waiting for him to return. Paul would often read it by the light of a flickering candle in the trench, finding comfort in the words that had been written centuries before. The day it happened was like any other. The soldiers had been ordered to advance across no man's land, a barren, bombed-out stretch of earth between the opposing trenches. It was a death trap where men fell by the dozens to machine gun fire and shells. As Paul moved forward, he kept his head down, clutching his rifle, every step measured and cautious. But then, in an instant, everything changed. The crack of a rifle shot echoed through the air, and before Paul could react, he felt a sharp impact in his chest. The force of the bullet knocked him to the ground, and he lay there stunned, expecting to feel the pain of a mortal wound. But as he lay in the mud, gasping for breath, he realized something extraordinary. He wasn't hurt. The bullet hadn't pierced his body. Slowly, Paul reached into his coat and pulled out the book, his mother's book. The bullet had struck the book, tearing through the pages, but stopping just short of his heart. Paul couldn't believe it. The book, that little piece of home he had carried with him, had saved his life. Shaking, he pressed the book to his chest and said a silent prayer of thanks. As he looked around, he saw the bodies of his comrades laying still in the dirt. Many of them hadn't been as lucky. But Paul was alive, and he knew that he owed his life to that book. Years later, after the war had finally ended and Paul had returned home, he kept the book as a cherished memento. By that point, it was tattered and torn, with a bullet hole still quite visible. But to Paul, it was a symbol of hope, survival, and, most importantly, the bond he shared with his mother. He told this story to his children, and they passed it down through the family. The book, with its frayed edges and yellowed pages, became a treasured family heirloom. Then, history repeated itself. Paul's son David grew up hearing the story of the book that had saved his father's life. When David was drafted into World War II, Paul gave him the book and told him to keep it with him, just as he had once done. David, like his father before him, carried it into battle, not knowing what fate had in store. It was 1944, and during a fierce battle in Italy, David found himself in the heat of combat. The situation was dire, and the enemy was closing in. As he moved through the rubble-strewn streets, a shot rang out. The bullet struck David in the chest, just as it had once struck his father years earlier. And just like his father, David fell to the ground, clutching the book. When he looked at it, he saw that the bullet had torn through the cover, through the words of Shakespeare. Yet, once again, it had stopped before reaching his heart. David survived the war, and when he returned home, he told his father what had happened. The two men, each with their own story of survival, marveled at the incredible coincidence that had saved both their lives. It was 1945, and the world was nearing the end of the most devastating conflict in human history. World War II had brought destruction on an unimaginable scale, but the horror was far from over. In August of that year, a man named Tsutomu Yamaguchi found himself far from home on a business trip in Hiroshima, Japan. Yamaguchi was an engineer working for Mitsubishi, and though he was looking forward to returning to his family, fate had other plans in store for him. It was the morning of August 6, 1945, and Yamaguchi was preparing to head to the train station when he suddenly realized he'd forgotten something. As he turned back to retrieve it, a blinding flash of light filled the sky, followed by a deafening explosion. The United States had dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Yamaguchi was less than 2 miles from ground zero. The force of the blast knocked him to the ground, and he was badly burned. His eardrums ruptured, his vision blurred, and his entire body was in pain. The intense heat of the explosion seared his upper body, and the blast wave threw him into a nearby ditch. Stunned and disoriented, Yamaguchi struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The once vibrant city was suddenly reduced to smoldering ruins, and the cries of the wounded and the dying filled the air. But miraculously, he survived. Dazed and injured, Yamaguchi found shelter and waited for help. The city around him was in ruins, with streets filled with the dead and the dying. Fires raged uncontrollably, and a dark mushroom-shaped cloud loomed ominously over the city. Despite the chaos, Yamaguchi managed to find 2 of his colleagues who had also survived the blast. Together, they sought refuge in an air raid shelter, their minds struggling to grasp the scale of the devastation. Eventually, Yamaguchi and his colleagues made their way to the train station, hoping to escape the nightmare that had once been Hiroshima. The journey was perilous, with the wounded and the dying all around them, but Yamaguchi's thoughts remained fixed on one thing: getting home to his family. After a harrowing journey through the ruined landscape, he finally boarded a train bound for Nagasaki. Yamaguchi returned to his hometown of Nagasaki on August 8th, just 2 days after the bombing of Hiroshima, still reeling from the experience. Despite his wounds, Yamaguchi felt relieved to be with his family once again. He received medical treatment for his burns and injuries, but the psychological scars ran much deeper. The horror of what he had witnessed in Hiroshima haunted him, and he struggled to make sense of it all. But his ordeal was far from over. On the morning of August 9th, 1945, Yamaguchi reported for work at the Mitsubishi shipyard, determined to continue with his life. As he explained to his supervisor what had happened in Hiroshima, a familiar light filled the sky. Another blinding flash, another thunderous explosion. The United States had dropped a second atomic bomb, this time on Nagasaki. Once again, Yamaguchi found himself at the epicenter of destruction. This time, he was less than 2 miles from ground zero. The blast threw him to the ground, shattering windows and collapsing buildings all around him. The explosion was so powerful that it had leveled much of Nagasaki, killing tens of thousands instantly. Remarkably, Yamaguchi survived yet again, despite being caught in the middle of 2 of the most devastating events in human history. He sustained additional injuries, but somehow he lived. After the second bombing, Yamaguchi made his way through the devastated city, searching for his wife and child. Miraculously, they had also survived the blast, having taken shelter in a tunnel. The family was reunited amid the ruins of Nagasaki, and together they faced the grim aftermath of the bombing. The horrors Yamaguchi had witnessed in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki left him forever changed. He was one of the few people who had experienced the unimaginable destruction of 2 atomic bombs firsthand, and the weight of that experience would stay with him for the rest of his life. Yamaguchi's survival is nothing short of miraculous. Twice he was at the epicenter of atomic blasts that claimed the lives of over 200,000 people combined. And yet, he lived to tell the tale. After the war, Yamaguchi became an outspoken advocate for nuclear disarmament, sharing his story with the world in the hopes that no one would ever have to endure what he had. He traveled across Japan, speaking about the horrors of nuclear weapons and calling for their abolition. His message was clear: no one should ever have to suffer the way he and so many others had. In 1954, Tsutomu Yamaguchi was officially recognized as a hibakusha, a survivor of both atomic bombings. He was the only person confirmed to have been in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki when the bombs fell. His life was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the unfathomable twists of fate. Despite his injuries and the trauma he endured, Yamaguchi lived a long life, passing away in 2010 at the ripe old age of 93. He left behind a legacy of peace, hope, and a reminder of the devastating power of nuclear weapons. 2 men separated by continents and decades, yet bound by incredible twists of fate. Paul Beck and his son David, saved by the same book and 2 world wars. Tsutomu Yamaguchi, twice spared from atomic annihilation by sheer luck. Or was it something more? In both stories, survival hinged on improbable events, defying the odds in ways that baffle the imagination. Is it destiny, providence, or just a reminder that life is full of mysteries we may never fully understand? In the end, all we can really say is, what a coincidence.